This is All of It. I'm Allison Stewart, live from the WNYC studios in Soho. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. I'm really grateful that you're here. On today's show, we'll take stock of how New York's legal cannabis rollout has gone with New York Times reporter Ashley Southall. And the smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies will permeate the studio today because Marissa Rothkopf Bates is here. She's the author of The Secret Life of Chocolate Chip Cookies. And this hour, we'll have two books that are coming out tomorrow. Xochitl Gonzalez will join us to talk about her latest novel, Last Night in Brooklyn. That's the plan. So let's get this started with men. The stats are frightening. Men are more likely to commit murder than women and are less likely to graduate from college, more likely to die by suicide, less likely to seek mental health care. There's been a lot of attention paid to what men are experiencing in the 21st century and why. Journalist Jordan Ritter-Kahn decided to follow four very different men over the course of a few years to document what goes on in an average man's life and to understand what lessons they had received about what it means to be a man. There's Gideon, a handsome West Point graduate who is having marital troubles. There's Joseph, a law student grappling with childhood trauma. Ryan, a fighter who comes to grips with his sexuality. And then there's Nate, a black trans man who has to decide what aspects of masculinity he wants to embrace in his new life. The resulting book is titled American Men. It's out tomorrow. And I'm joined now in studio by author Jordan Ritter-Kahn. Nice to meet you, Jordan.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for having me.
And I wanted to tell everybody the book is out tomorrow, and Jordan is speaking tomorrow night at Taylor & Company Books in Brooklyn. When did you first get interested in writing about masculinity?
You know, I've been fascinated by it for almost my entire life. I mean, going back to when I was a kid, I had a lot of really close male friendships and would hear often things about men and boys not having those kind of like that kind of emotional intimacy, not being willing to kind of open up, not being willing to be vulnerable. And as I became a journalist, I found myself quickly drawn to the kind of stories where you can sink very, very deeply into another person's life. And because I've written a lot about sports, I've often found myself writing the stories of men and writing stories where men are open and vulnerable in ways that we're often told they don't like to be. And so I found my way toward this book through kind of that process of telling these intimate stories over and over again.
When did you realize that personal stories were the way you were going to tell this? Yeah,
I think that's... As a reader, that's what I love. I love, I want to get swept away by a story. I think that reading nonfiction books that grapple with big ideas in a really explicit way can be interesting and paradigm shifting, but I'm moved by story, and I wanted to tell ordinary people's stories. And these four men were willing to kind of let me kind of tell their story with a level of intimacy and depth that I knew that I would respond to as a reader, and that I knew that I would love to write as well.
As a journalist, what were some of the questions you had about masculinity at this point?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of explore this idea that I didn't really find my way toward until I got going on the book. But this idea of how we all kind of inherit a certain ideal of what a man is supposed to be. And that can look different depending on your family, depending on your cultural context. But we all have these ideas from the time we're very young children around who we're supposed to be. And we all, at some point or another, do not live up to that ideal. We all kind of find ourselves grappling with our own failures to kind of meet this ideal of what a man is supposed to be. And I wanted to be able to kind of explore what happens in that space. What happens when you are trying to figure out your relationship to the man that you've been taught that you're supposed to be from the time you were a very young child.
I have to ask the question. You look at it, you think, really? Another book about men? Everything is geared towards men, our healthcare system, our laws, even the current state of politics. Why is this book important now?
Well, we're about half the population. It feels like that there's just that. I think that just telling stories about us in ways that get at pieces of ourselves that we don't often like to show, that get at the ways that we grapple with traumatic experiences, the ways that we grapple with kind of power that we have in some situations, with feelings of powerlessness in others, what that does to us. Getting into stories in a way that kind of shows some of the softer sides of kind of our experiences, that shows the ways in which we kind of long for and grasp our way toward human connection, felt like it was kind of exploring a side of men's experiences that sometimes we don't like to show, that sometimes we don't like to tell those stories, but they're so central to who we are.
You note in the introduction the various ways that men are falling behind their female peers. I mentioned them in the intro, in education, in suicide rates, in addiction rates. What answers did you find about why men and boys are struggling in 2026?
I think that that story is a story that is in some ways very old. Men have always kind of struggled to things like deaths of despair, suicide, overdoses have been things that men have always kind of been more likely to experience. And I feel like we're in some ways a very old struggle is being mapped onto kind of new technologies and a shifting culture in this current moment.
Interesting, yeah.
And this idea of just, again, that feeling of specifically gendered inadequacy, that feeling of not quite living up to who I feel like I am supposed to be as a man, is one that I think previous generations have experienced, that future generations have experienced. And what we are seeing right now is I just think kind of the current mutation of a crisis that's kind of just baked into struggling to be a human being.
But also the technology, I think, is a really big important part of this.
Yeah, I think, technology is kind of isolating everyone in a lot of ways. I do think that sometimes we talk a lot about male loneliness right now in our culture, but statistics show that everyone is increasingly lonely, and I do think that it's important to point that out. But I think that as we become more isolated, as we become kind of more sucked down certain rabbit holes online, like we are more likely to kind of embrace pieces of ourselves that do not that don't connect us to others, that don't kind of lean into basic empathy, that make us kind of siloed, angry, and less likely to kind of do the hard work of encountering other people fully as human beings. And I think that we as men need to be working on that, need to be working on having that human connection.
My guest is journalist Jordan Ritter-Kahn. His new book, American Men, looks at 4 men over the course of many years to consider masculinity in modern times. The book is out tomorrow, and Jordan is speaking tomorrow night at Taylor & Company Books in Brooklyn. Listeners, we'd like to get you in on this conversation. What does masculinity mean to you? How would you define what manhood means in America today? And what questions you have for Jordan about his book? Give us a call at 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. How did you decide what 4 men to cover in your book?
It was a long process. I cast a very, very wide net. I talked to dozens, more than 50. But I knew that I wanted stories that would complement each other. I knew that I wanted one man who had some direct relationship to violence. And so in Ryan, he's a gay man who the book follows him during a time when he's closeted, but he's also getting in a lot of bar fights and kind of navigating, trying to kind of figure out his own identity. I knew that I wanted men who had experience with the military, just because that's so much of how we tend to define masculinity in this country. And so 2 of them, Gideon and Joseph, are both veterans. Gideon, a West Point graduate. I knew that I wanted a trans man. I wanted to tell the story of a man who had kind of embraced masculinity in a way that was more intentional, that so much of kind of gender is just kind of the waters that we are swimming in from the time we're very, very young children. So much of it is subconscious. And I wanted an experience to write about the experience of someone who has had to be a bit more conscious in kind of how he wanted to embrace masculinity. I also wanted someone who had been kind of in the evangelical church, just because that in this country is a huge kind of arena for a certain idea of masculinity to be on display. And we have that in Joseph. So it was really, ultimately there was kind of this idea that everyone's story is interesting enough to be told if they are willing to dig into the really deep stuff. And so finding the men who were willing to do that, whose stories would complement each other, was kind of how I found my way to these 4.
You were with them for 4 years, yes?
5.
5 years, 5 years. What did those 5 years look like for you as a journalist? How did you go about tracking their lives?
Sure. It was going to see them often, and just being, when I would be with them, it would just be, as much time as you'll give me, I want to be there. As much as we can be together, I want to be there. As much as I can be interviewing you about your past life, but also kind of following you through your life right now. And it's a lot to ask. I mean, they open themselves up to, in terms of the amount of time, in terms of the amount of vulnerability, they open themselves up to an incredible degree. And so it was just checking in constantly, making sure that when they were ready for me to come and be with them, I could be on that plane and be there with them in person as much as I could. And
Did you ever see them making a mistake? You saw the mistake coming down the road and you didn't, but you have to kind of be a journalist and watch it happen?
That's such a good question. At times I certainly feel like that, but also, I'm a journalist, but I also, when you are writing about people so intimately, there are moments where you come to really care for them. And so I would talk with them about like what's going on in their lives and kind of try to, I wouldn't always feel like I have to be totally removed from this. Yeah. Like they become such a huge part of your life and you care for them so deeply that you want to kind of, when you see that decision coming down the pike, you want to talk it through in a way that might kind of allow them to see another path.
You allowed the men to look at the way you have written about them. And it's not always flattering what you wrote about them. Did you receive any pushback?
I was surprised by the degree to which I did not, except there was one moment with one man who, and what I did is I read it out loud to them the first time because I wanted to see their faces when they heard it. I wanted to experience it in the moment. But one man at one point was like, I don't know if I can do this, after a particularly difficult moment of, something that he would see as kind of his own failing, a description of that. But then we didn't talk for a couple weeks. And the next time we talked, he said, and this is one of the men who's a parent, he said, when I think about my child reading this at age 15, that feels really scary to me. But when I think about my child reading about kind of this failure of mine at age 40, when I'm an old man, and they get to see more fully kind of who I was and what kind of made me into the father that I've been to them their entire life, that actually feels kind of nice. And so opening myself up in this way actually is something that I want to do. And so he did not ask me to change a single thing. None of them really asked me to change a single thing.
Did they want you to add anything?
One of them wanted me to make sure to describe how handsome he was in a certain moment. One of the men ends up kind of walking on the runway in a fashion show, and he wanted to point out that he looked good. And so I did, because he did. He looked great.
Let's talk to Joe from Poughkeepsie. Hi, Joe. Thank you for making the time to call All of It. You're on the air.
Hi, Allison. Thank you for taking my call. I was wondering if your guest had considered at all sort of the economic challenges that men face in today's world in terms of reaching life milestones and how those challenges might affect, expectations surrounding masculinity.
100%. I talked to someone who said he felt like the U.S. economy is almost the fifth character in this book.
Oh, interesting.
And these men certainly go through really kind of difficult periods of financial stress. But the one thing that I'll say is that around that is that there's something about, as men, we learn about being a provider. It's something that we're taught from a really young age. And there is something about kind of that role that is so clarifying to us. Like it can be like, if I do this, I have worth. If I provide for myself, if I provide for a family, then I as a human being am someone kind of worthy of love and care. And as there have been in this country, wages have not kept up with inflation. it has become more and more difficult to kind of achieve some of these milestones that we look to as markers of adulthood and certainly as manhood, yet kind of grasping toward that kind of role and the clarity that it gives, the message that it gives you that you're a person of worth, is something that I think a lot of men really, really struggle with.
My guest is journalist Jordan Ritter-Kahn. His new book is American Men. It looks at 4 men over the course of many years to consider masculinity in modern times. Listeners, we'd like to hear from you. What does masculinity mean to you? How would you define what manhood means in America today? Or maybe you have a question for Jordan. Our number is 212-433-9692, 212-433-WNYC. We'll be right back. You're listening to All of It on WNYC. I'm Allison Stewart. My guest in studio is journalist Jordan Ritter-Kahn. His new book, American Men, looks at 4 men over the course of many years to consider masculinity in modern times. The book is out tomorrow. Jordan is speaking tomorrow night at Taylor & Company Books in Brooklyn. Let's go through the few of the men. First, Gideon. How would you describe Gideon?
Gideon is someone who typifies every single masculine ideal from the time he is a little boy. He is tall, he is handsome, he is smart, he is athletic. He goes to West Point as a baseball player, and everything comes easy to him until a moment when it doesn't. His wife has an affair with his commanding officer in the Army, and a lot of his story is about kind of the aftermath of that, and it's not really about just what it's like to be cheated on. It's about the blow to his identity as someone who has seen himself as someone for whom this was impossible, as someone who's seen himself as someone who has just gotten everything he's wanted his entire life and has been everything that everyone else has wanted him to be naturally, and now has to wrestle with kind of who he is as a man and as a human being once that image of himself has been dashed.
Ryan is next. He's a man who's struggling with his sexuality. He has an impulse towards violence. He kind of likes it, actually. What made him a compelling subject?
You know, the first time I talked to him, and he told me about the fact that he'd been bullied a lot as a kid. He never fought back. And he was bullied because people could often see, especially through adolescence, they could tell that he was gay before he could tell that he was gay. And when he becomes as an adult and as he's beginning to wrestle with his sexuality, he has this moment where he snaps and he gets into a fight, and all of a sudden has this moment of feeling like, oh, now I understand why kids used to bully me, because it feels kind of great. Like there's something about the like, that feeling doesn't last, certainly, and treating others that way can kind of strip away at your sense of yourself over time. But that immediate feeling of power is something that he becomes kind of intoxicated by.
It was really interesting because he said when he was younger, he didn't want to learn to fight, but he was told he had to fight. Yeah. How much of what these men went through and how much of what they told you dated back to their childhood?
Really, I mean, with all of them, because again, it is just like, I think gender is just like the waters we are swimming in without even really knowing it. It's these lessons that we are learning that we don't know anyone is actually teaching us. I think of Ryan and his father after the first time he gets beaten up as a 6-year-old, his father taking him to the basement, putting on the boxing gloves and telling him to hit the bag again. I think about Gideon kind of learning that he exists almost as kind of a trophy in his family because he is so good at everything as a child, and that's what by performing at a certain level, that's how he kind of has worth. I think of Joseph, who experiences some pretty awful childhood trauma, but for whom kind of the currency of masculinity is kind of used as a tool to do some really horrible things to him from an older boy. And Nate, the trans man, just being knowing that he feels like a boy as a small child who the world sees as a girl, knowing that he wants to kind of inhabit, his relationship to gender in a very different way, but not knowing how to do that feeling impossible to him. It's just such a hugely formative part of all of them.
Let's take some more calls. Emily is calling in from Brooklyn. Hi, Emily, you're on the air.
Hi. I remember growing up as a girl, I felt super relieved that I wasn't expected to fight the way that the boys were. And as an adult, with adult women with a lot of relationships with men, I'm just wondering if the author can comment on what is the difference, or like, is there a difference in the way that we're seeing men perform their masculinity and spend the currency of masculinity, as you just said, in all male versus mixed versus female audiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's a line in the book that's specifically about Ryan, the gay man who is also drawn to violence, that says he wanted to love men and to brutalize them. And I spoke with someone recently who had read the book, who said to me that he feels like that's kind of how all men are, regardless of sexual orientation or anything else. We want to love each other. We want to be tender with each other. We want to be emotionally connected with each other. And yet, when we are afraid, when our backs are up against the wall, we often want to find some way to signal dominance to each other. And that can be physical, but it can be through so many other things. And I think that, sometimes in settings when it's just us, I kind of think you see both of those things turned up. Like, you can see moments of real vulnerability and tenderness and care, but you can also see moments when you do feel fearful, or you do feel disempowered, and you turn to kind of your basest impulses in ways that are destructive.
Let's talk to Chris in Manhattan. Hey, Chris, thanks for taking the time to call All of It. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. My dad was from another country. He came here. He started his own business. I never saw him care at all what other people thought about who he was and how he defined himself. I have a brother who's still alive. He's 9 years older than me. He went through the school system in Manhattan and in Queens, and where we also lived. And I always felt that he was trying to get everybody's approval, even by the way he spoke. He would talk like this. And I thought, that's not you. When his wife died, he didn't speak like that. All of that was erased for a time. And then he reverted back to it. And I always felt sorry for him, because I thought he's always trying to get the approval of other men for his own self-worth. And so I had to choose between the two. And with the exception of when I went to a private school for a little bit as a sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, and I learned how to dance because they had dance lessons. And when I went back to the public school, somebody wanted to have a fight with me because I had, I shown that. And that's the only regret I had. If somebody had shown me with boxing gloves how to fight back to this guy, I would have felt a lot better about getting into that fight. But other than that, and my dad, was disappointed that I lost the fight. But I thought, well, you should have taught me how to do that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to dive in here because it brought up a question for me, Jordan. I thought about nature versus nurture here, and how families treated these men as boys. Because Gideon, being a superior athlete, his family expected a certain amount of him. Nate, he talked about the church. What is your take on nature versus nurture?
Yeah, I think it's... there's one of the men in the story we've had, or in this book, believes strongly that it's all nurture. I feel like it's both. I just feel like it's both fully 100% all of the time. I mean, we are our genes and our circumstances. And I do think that the thing that we have the most control over with the men and boys in our lives is nurture. And so leaning into the ways in which we can impact the shape of a person's life is what we should kind of have in mind as we engage with the world. But certainly so much of this is kind of hardwired into who we are.
This text says, I love so much that you included a trans man And I also see how that could push men away who actually need to read this book. How do you hope to reach that audience of men that are stuck in their definitions of what masculinity means?
Yeah. My hope is that for anyone who reads this book, any man, but really any person, that you'll see some piece of yourself reflected in each of the 4 stories. And I know that I see some piece of myself reflected in each of their stories. And in Nate's story, particularly the trans man, I do think that there is, so much of kind of, again, the way that he kind of has to think about this stuff at 10, 11, 12 years old in ways that, other boys would not be thinking about it so directly. And so my hope is just that men will, of any kind of ideological persuasion, will give it a chance and will be open to the ways in which they can connect to another person's experience, even the experience of someone who is quite different from them. Because I think that there are elements of his story that anyone will feel relatable to themselves.
My guest is journalist Jordan Ritter-Kahn. His new book, American Man, looks at 4 men over the course of many years to consider masculinity in modern times. Let's talk to Tony, who's calling in from Queens. Hey, Tony, thanks for calling All of It. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you for having me speak. One of the things I was very lucky. I grew up in a very large family that was actually very matriarchal. The women were in charge. And what was wonderful about that was that I actually got a lot of examples of what masculinity was. The men in my family, my uncles, my dad, they all had different views of what it was. One thought, okay, it's about intellectualism. One thought it was about very physicalism. And so what was wonderful having all those examples was that I never really thought, well, this is a man. I just thought, okay, well, I kind of like what Uncle Greg is doing here. I kind of like what Dad is doing here. And you can kind of form yourself in that way, just having those options. And I think the most humorous example I can think of was that one of my uncles told me, like, he was really into scouting. And he said, okay, I said, well, what's so big about Boy Scouting? And he said, well, it teaches you, quote unquote, how to be a man. So I thought, okay, well, that's great. That means they're going to teach me how to ask a girl out. They're going to teach me how to, like, comb my hair correctly, how to dress nice, that kind of thing, because that's what I got from my dad. Okay, well, a part of being a man is, okay, you have to, like, a straight man is that you have to know how to, ask a girl out, that kind of stuff. And when I went to the first, Weeblos meeting, I was like, okay, what, we're going camping? What's going on here? and that idea, like, okay, listen, and I understood that's a type of man, because that was my uncle who I love very, very much. But that wasn't the type of person I wanted to be, and that was okay. And I think the big thing, even now just saying it, was that there was love and regard for all the examples that I had of what masculinity was. There was never a sense that this is right or this is wrong. If you love the people and the people who love you are the ones guiding you in this as a straight man, there's a beauty to that. It gives you choice because there's no shame. And one of the things I always say to my friends now is that, listen, I was very lucky in that I had a male figure in my life, my father, who taught me everything a father is supposed to teach you. And then I had the male figures in my life who taught me all the stuff that your father doesn't want you to know, like that.
Thank you so much for calling in. And let's talk to Philip in Montclair. Hi, Philip. Thanks for calling All of It.
Hi, yes. Can you all hear me?
Yes, I hear you. You're on the air.
Fantastic. My comment is, I was curious on what the author's thoughts are on, like, some of the more traditional male spaces. So I've been I'm a missionary's kid, and I was, like, in a fraternity and, like, all the things that are supposed to be bad examples of masculinity. But I've been very lucky and have had really positive, meaningful relationships with men over the course of my life. I've been very, very lucky. So I'm wondering if there's, like, from the book and, like, things that the author learned to tell, like, younger, mid-20s, mid-30s men about, like, how to be positive in these spaces that sometimes aren't always positive, because I've had great experiences through those. So I'm just curious if that has come up at all in the process of writing this book and talking to these guys.
This goes into your own experience because you are the dad of a son.
I am, yeah. So I mean, that's such a great question. And as I think about my son, who's almost 3 years old now, I'll be thinking about kind of the spaces that he'll occupy with other boys and eventually with men. But what you talked about kind of all male spaces, places. I grew up playing sports, and found kind of on basketball as my sport, and in that setting, like some of the most like intimate, like close knit relationships where we were really genuinely vulnerable with each other, where we experienced intense emotions together, but also some stuff that I'm is look back on and do not think very fondly of. Like some real misogyny, especially, as a teenage boy, things that I would hear on the bus that, I'm not proud to have not like kind of said something against in the moment. And I think that in those spaces, it is just a matter of like, if we can feel like safe with each other, if we can not punish each other for stepping out of line of kind of the script that we're kind of all taught, if we can just like embrace kind of like the caller mentioned, the closeness that can be fostered in a setting like a sports team or a fraternity or in the military or other settings, like and give each other permission to be our full selves, I think we'll be kind of working toward a world for ourselves that is kind of healthier for all of us.
My guest has been Jordan Ritter-Kahn. His new book, American Men. It's out tomorrow. Jordan is speaking tomorrow night at Taylor and Company Books in Brooklyn. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Allison. This was a lot of fun.